So I give thanks today for how God has blessed this church these past 40 years. And I also give thanks to God for you and your faithful witness on behalf of the good news of the gospel. So today, in addition to celebrating your 40th anniversary as a church, I ask you to make this time a rededication of yourselves to serving God's mission in the world. I know it is a day in which you will ordain and install new leadership, elders and deacons. I know it is a day that you will also affirm and celebrate an emeritus elder. You have a tradition of elder and deacon leadership and pastoral leadership that continues to motivate you to look at the world and what good news there is to bring to it as disciples of Christ. These are anxious times in which we live, and the gospel needs to be proclaimed. People, systems, and nations are in desperate need of transformation. So my sermon today that I offer is to help you discern where and how God is calling you now as you move into another decade of your ministry. So throughout the Bible, God causes defining moments in order to prepare leadership to begin new chapters in salvation history. When any person is confronted with this sort of event, it is usually the time when one's deepest values come in conflict with life situations. These circumstances give each of us the opportunity to choose a path. Over the years, the cumulative effect of these decisions help form and shape our character. There is no doubt that we are each the sum total of our personal decisions. There are choices that challenge us in a deeper way by asking us to choose between two or more ideals in which we deeply believe. Character is formed in these situations because we commit ourselves to irreversible courses of actions that shape us personally and professionally, and I would also add, as a Christian. These defining moments uncover things in us that have been hidden, and we discover things about ourselves and reveal them to others. It is in these times that we discover whether we will live up to our personal ideas or only talk about them. Here we discover something in a very painful way. We discover who we really are. This has happened to all of God's leaders. For example, Abraham had his defining moment when he heard the voice of God calling him from the security of Ur to the insecurity of the life of a nomad wandering in the wilderness. Can you imagine the conversations that took place in that home and the explanation Abraham had to his extended family? Abraham obviously spoke very forcefully and convincingly to those who would make the journey with him. Through his decision, God began his work of salvation. We now then see Joseph, best loved son of his father Abraham, but hated by his older brothers, and was sold into slavery. He was brought into Potiphar's household as a servant and soon proved so trustworthy that he was put in charge of his entire house. Only a short time passed until Potiphar's wife repeatedly tempted Joseph to have an affair with her. This was his defining moment when he refused her. She falsely then accused Joseph, and he was sent to prison. His decision planted the seeds that produced the Exodus. What about Moses, we say, who faced his defining moment before the burning bush? He reluctantly gave up the security and the obscurity of a shepherd's life to face the Pharaoh and herd a bunch of grumbling slaves to freedom with Pharaoh's armies in hot pursuit. You remember the story of the Red Sea? The defining moment of Moses led to the birth of a new nation. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate example of life's defining moments. After his baptism, he was taken into the wilderness and for 40 days and nights struggled with his mission. The author of his defining moment was the devil himself. Only after Jesus faced Satan and made his choice clear did the devil leave him. This was the defining moment that began the ministry of Jesus and changed the world forever. Jesus had a way of producing defining moments for his disciples as he called each of them to follow him. The first one to face this was Simon and his brother Andrew, who Jesus called as they were fishing along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Farther along the lake, Jesus found the sons of Zebedee, James and John, mending nets in their boat. He called them, and they immediately left their boat and their father and followed him. The defining moments and the response of these disciples, as well as others, have had an impact on history that continues to this day. Remember, Jesus started with only calling 12. And all that we experience today as Christians is the result of only 12. Modern history has taken turns that seem improbable due to the response of individuals and their defining moments. During the month of February, our children in the public schools in this country recognize the historical contributions made by African Americans that helped shape this country. Actually, this is the 50th year anniversary of the civil rights movement in the United States. 50 years, where it changed the course of our country's understanding of human rights. Doesn't mean it's perfect. It means we continue to struggle. But it made such a difference that now we have a changed conscience about what it is that we do and how it impacts others. Here's an example of one of those defining moments out of history. We will never forget the day or the event when Rosa Parks, an African-American domestic worker, a housekeeper, refused to surrender her seat on a bus to a white man. This event occurred on December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama. Mrs. Parks, prior to her arrest on this occasion, had observed the quiet strength of her mother and her grandmother. She had tried unsuccessfully to register to vote and had experienced public humiliation where bus drivers insisted that blacks pay at the front and then enter at the back door to sit in the back of the bus. In fact, sometimes the drivers would take the fare and then shut the door and drive off, leaving Rosa and the other blacks just standing on the street. This continuing mistreatment, and not only of her, but also of the black race in countless ways, accumulated in producing that defining moment for Rosa Parks. And after this incident, a 382-day bus boycott eventually led to the desegregation of the city buses. Rosa Parks is known as the mother of the civil rights movement in the United States. But she has said that she would like for people to know, not that claim, but that her faith in God, her religious convictions, and her church helped give her the strength to meet her defining moments with courage, which in turn ignited the national civil rights movement and changed the social fabric of America. The power of the gospel, the power of God in our lives, The power of being the community of faith together that encourages and gives courage to each of us in order to act in a defining moment, to change the world forever, to not be the same. Now we come back to the Old Testament reading this morning. The story of Jonah showed beyond the shadow of a doubt that God chooses to use reluctant people to do his work. You read the whole story. We know that Jonah did not volunteer to go to witness to the people of Nineveh. He didn't even want to be there. The story has several unusual twists and turns, and the bottom line seemed to be that if at first you don't respond currently to your defining moment, you'll meet it again and again, because God won't let you alone. Jonah had successfully lived under the radar of public recognition all of his life, and he liked it that way. He was satisfied with having a very small vision and very little responsibility, virtually no pressure. There is safety in smallness of vision and narrowness of mind and heart, and he found it. Then God interrupted this narrow routine and presented to Jonah a series of defining moments that challenged him to leave his comfort zone. Actually, that is an understatement. Jonah felt about the whole situation. He didn't really like the Ninevites. However, these challenges revealed much about Jonah and more about God. All of Jonah's presuppositions concerning life was challenged by this call of God to the Ninevite people. He was stretched between his two value systems. He never expected to have his comfort area and his narrow lifestyle interrupted by God's demands that he catch the vision of a larger world. Jonah was basically working with rural people, and he sincerely believed that God had always been partial to them. The entire Hebrew Bible reflects this belief. Life began in a rural setting, the Garden of Eden, and cities were cesspools of evil in his mind. Sodom and Gomorrah is an example. Had not all the prophets spoken against the cities and then retreated to the countryside for rest and spiritual reflection? Not only was Nineveh an urban place, but also it was not even in Israel. It was the greatest of the capitals of the Aryan Empire, located on the left bank of the Tigris River in the northeastern part of Mesopotamia. Today we would know that as Iraq. Jonah thought God was a tribal deity, limited only to Israel. It was only Israel's God. That would be as silly as saying as God only belongs to the United States, or God only belongs to Korea, or God only belongs to Bolivia, or God only belongs to, you get the idea. Why should God or Jonah care about him? That's a question he raised. Jonah's God was too small, his vision was not too limited, and his heart was too cold and hard to get involved in this situation. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He ran away. He assumed that if he could get out of God's territory, he would escape the claims of God and avoid that defining moment. His method of doing this was to take the next boat to Tarshish, considered at the borders of that ancient world. So you know what happens with the rest of the story if you've read the book. In his absolute defiance, his determined disobedience to the command of God, Jonah ran to the nearest boat dock, which was in Joppa, and bought a ticket to the farthest place he could imagine in the world, thinking that he would escape God. The interesting thing is that Jonah was found sleeping through a raging storm that frightened even seasoned sailors. And when confronted by the captain of the boat, Jonah told them that the Lord was punishing him for his disobedience and for them to throw him overboard. and that the storm would subside. Jonah would have rather died than to do what God asked him. Wow. However, the heathen sailors had more compassion for Jonah than he had shown for the Ninevites, and continued to try to row the boat to safety. And finally, they did throw him overboard, and immediately what happened is the sea calmed. They were so fearful of the Lord that they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Perhaps this was those sailors' defining moment. So this is how Jonah found himself in the stomach of that great fish for 3 days and 3 nights. The Lord dealt with Jonah and finally commanded the fish to throw Jonah up on the dry land. We don't know how much time lapse before the Lord gave Jonah instructions once again to go and preach to the Ninevites. He told Jonah what to say as he preached. And to Jonah's surprise and dismay, the people of Nineveh believed, called a fast, and put on sackcloth. Those are the verses that we heard today. From the greatest of them to the least of them, from the most powerful for those who had very little powerful. The king, when he heard of this, arose from his throne, and the king threw off his robe and put on the sackcloth and sat on the ashes. How could Jonah ever have imagined this turn of events? The king even issued a proclamation that called on all of his people to fast, to put on the sackcloth, and to call on God earnestly, that each might turn from their wicked and violent ways. When God saw their deeds, he relentlessly concerning the calamity which he had declared he would bring upon them, he did not do it. He didn't dissolve them. He didn't eradicate them. This king took his duty seriously and heard the word of the Lord. And he met his defining moment with amazing haste and solidarity. Now everyone repented except for Jonah. He was disgusted and irate that God was even gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness. What a pitiful man Jonah turned out to be, whining at God because he blessed his preaching, allowing him to be the vessel that delivered the message of God's displeasure with the people of Nineveh, and therefore Jonah the instrument of their revival and survival. Jonah was so upset that he begged God to let him die. If there had been a comedy network in the day of Jonah, some comedian would have had a wonderful time with this story, pretending to be Jonah. I leave that to your imagination. This story makes it clear that God is always eager to save a heathen people, and that in the heart of the heathen there is always the possibility of response and repentance to God's message. Jonah did not have that kind of spirit, but it is clear that God does. He accomplishes his purposes even when we fail the defining moment test. I believe that this story calls us to always recognize that our role is to reach those who need to hear the good news and need to be saved by God's grace. We are not to be the judge about whether they're good enough or whether God should care about them, or even that we should care about them. God does care, and this is what this story says to us. Now we come to the time when we must decide which this means to us today. It is time to look at our lives and to think about how God would grade us on our response to personal defining moments. Remember that King David, with all of his wonderful qualities, failed one particular defining moment when he lusted after Bathsheba and acted upon that lust. There was no turning back after the deed was done. There is no escape from logical consequences. So what about your personal life? What about your family life? What about your business life? Defining moments are sometimes as insignificant as signing your name to a half-truth, or spreading unfounded gossip, or calling home to say you were detained at the office or at school or wherever you were when you were really somewhere else. You can provide your own scenario for your daily activities. But like Jonah, we often try to run away from our defining moments. But these times have a way of becoming like the television reruns we see over and over and over. It's not always a pretty scene. Churches also have defining moments. There is probably not a pastor around who has not witnessed or been part of a church which completely failed the defining moment test. Individual churches have decisions to make concerning issues that are soul-wrenching, horrific decisions that may get us out of our comfort zones. For example, during the time of Rosa Parks facing her defining moment, there were churches in Alabama that also had to face this issue about the injustices in their city. History shows that any pastor of a downtown church in any city in Alabama who preached racial inclusivity or spoke out against those injustices faced persecution from his congregation, and each was systematically replaced over a short period of time. You probably have heard those stories from your own experiences, maybe in your mother country or in other countries in the world. Sometimes it's not safe to do the right thing. Sometimes it is not safe to proclaim the gospel and act with righteousness. These churches at that time failed the test. They completely ignored the biblical admonition to love one another. And there is no difference in God's eyes of Jew nor Greek, black or white or brown or yellow, male or female, young or old, infirmed or healthy-bodied. Since the birth of the early church, as recorded in Paul's letters, through the present time, the church is at its best when it escapes the captivity of its culture and strips down to the basic tasks of loving, serving, and sharing the mystery of God's presence with hurting people. We need to understand, especially at this season of Epiphany, the season of light, of God's revelation to us, that it is this season to proclaim the glad tidings of God to all those who need to hear. People are hurting in so many ways. People are called upon to carry enormous burdens, and they desperately need help. They need to experience the touch of God as expressed through the church and through individuals. We must proclaim the good news to all people, and by all means. We must be willing to reach out to offer a healing touch, not only to people who are dying of a physical illness, but those also whose souls are in jeopardy. We do not need to be the judge or the jury about their lives up to this point, ready to condemn them as people. What the world needs more than anything is the loving, compassionate, and prophetic witness of the gospel that can only come through the love of Christ dwelling in each of us. Imagine the Church of Peace is facing one of these defining moments. Maybe not now, maybe in a week or so, or maybe in the coming year or down the road. What do you think the outcome will be? Will your church pass or will it fail? Think about yourself this week and your own defining personal moments. What will your report card reveal? Will it pass or will it fail? The call of God is not easy. The call of God may call us away from how we are presently living, like Jesus' calling of those first disciples, as we heard read in the passage from Mark. Sometimes we just want to get through our lives, just to survive, just to make it a little better for the next generation. But the defining moment is how we respond to God's call to live into the fullness of God's love. And that is to transform the world that we're part of. Now just take it a little better, and to make, not just to take this whole thing a little better and to lead happy lives for ourselves, but to transform the world so that all may know God's love, that justice would prevail, and therefore God's shalom may come to all. Your theme for your 40th anniversary is one to embrace, that goes along with this message. To be peacemakers who sow in peace, raise a harvest of righteousness. That is your call. That is where the defining moment comes. To choose to be safe and comfortable, or just make things a little better, and to go on living our happy lives? Or do we participate in the transformation of the world according to God's values? And now to each of you, both as individuals and as a church, listen to the words of Jesus calling us to our defining moments. Come, will you be my disciples and follow me? I continue to pray for you. I continue to hold you in my heart and pray that you will not fail, but that you will continue to show yourselves to be a faithful people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.